Eric. So I just wanted to give everyone a quick overview of the presentation today. I was going to provide a bit of background about the Grants and Contributions Management Association, explain a little bit why a framework best practice is a useful thing, talk a little bit about what a body of knowledge is, review a draft that we've been working on, a Grants and Contributions body of knowledge, a framework for that, talk a little bit about how technology is impacting grant management, review some case studies where we'll explore that in a little more depth, talk about our upcoming conference, and then we'll close the presentation and open the floor for questions. So GCMA, it was established in 2015 in the fall. It's a nonprofit. Its mission is to promote best practices in the use of information technology in the management of grants, contributions, and other funding mechanisms. And there's a number of reasons why those programs exist, but there's some common goals here. The scope of GCMA initially is limited to Canada, but our vision long-term is to spread our wings and work internationally, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. Our members, we're hoping, will be people from organizations that provide funding, so government, private foundations with private sector, and those that offer solutions that support the efficient and effective use of funding. By 2020, we're hoping we'll have a pretty solid members network that will have got our body of knowledge in place, a set of best practices, and that we'll have seen some of the integration of those practices by members through training certification programs and by links to solution providers that build on our practice models. So I've kind of picked a federal story here. It's probably not unique to the federal family, but there's been a range of drivers for modernizing grants management, at least at a federal level. I'm sure that's true elsewhere. And that evolution hints at, or that timeline here, it hints at an evolution of practice in the way grants are managed and an emerging body of knowledge. Certainly we've picked up some lessons. I've highlighted a couple in circles here that we'll kind of talk about or tease out as themes. One of them is being more client-focused. This came out early in 2005 with a federal renewal of transfer payment policy, looking at things like risk-based delivery as well. And the OAG announced a report federally in 2006 talking about reducing red tape. There was a whole blue ribbon panel established federally that looked at that challenge and came up with some recommendations. So all of this hints at an evolution of practice, and we've been sort of tracking that across different organizations. A framework then for best practice is kind of a useful thing, I think. Grants management is not really unique. The process models in other countries, for example, USA, Australia, and the United Kingdom, are very similar to what's going on in Canada. There are some variations in the details, but at a broad level, they're very similar. And our experience has evolved over 25 years through sort of documentation at high levels in policies and guidelines that have been produced by, in particular, government agencies. Grants represent about $1 trillion in North America alone, and in the U.S. they're spending about $660 billion. Our estimates are about $60 billion in Canada and $40 billion of that's federally. There's even granting occurring at the municipal level, so there's a wide range of folks engaged and involved in providing grant funding. So the goal of the framework is to optimize the return. There's really no common practice model in place. And certainly I see a lot of reinventing the wheel in some ways, revisiting and improving practice. A lot of that's organizational or program-based, but increasingly I'm seeing multi-organization practice models emerging. So the idea is to improve the overall investment portfolio. For example, in Canada, the $60 billion we spend, coming up with a framework will optimize the relationship between that investment, the risk, and the return. And so we're quite keen on developing a body of knowledge. So a body of knowledge is this is a formal definition I took off Wikipedia, but it's a complete set of terms, concepts, activities that make up a professional domain, and in this case, an association, and we're hoping to coordinate member input as the association, the Grants and Contribution Management Association. And there's some examples of that practice out in the community in other domains. For example, there's the PMBOK, which is the Business Analysis Body of Knowledge, and there's a PMBOK, which is about project management. So we're trying to emulate some of the examples in those professional domains. This is an example of the high-level process groups and knowledge areas that they manage through PMBOK. So we've started thinking about a GCBOK as a framework. The idea is to get the ball rolling and get people engaged in it. We've identified 6 process groups and 15 knowledge areas. The process groups we think are interrelated, and so there's some interdependencies between them. So I want to present just a high-level view of that. So, you move in program management from design to organizing, delivering, monitoring. And then programs often have cycles, 3 to 5 years, where they improve, adjust. It can be more regular than that. Ultimately, programs close or sunset, many of them. And I think in all cases, there's opportunities to learn and impact design, so that when you run programs either in future iterations or you start new programs, there's a common model for how they run, how they can improve. We've identified some these knowledge management areas, and there's a long list here. I'm not going to read all of them, but we've started to think about process models in each of those groups, and we thought maybe today we'd talk a little bit about number 4, 5, and 8, risk management, client recipient management, and financial management. So our case studies and some of our presentations will deal with some of those. But GCMA has been trying to cull out of the body of practice out there examples of how people are dealing with these different knowledge management areas, and try to document them into a body of knowledge. So here's an example of how we translate what was in the PMBOK. Now we're trying to push this into a grants and contributions context. So looking at different types of processes, so as process groups, and then looking at those knowledge management areas I just listed, and coming up with different models within each of those areas that build and extend practice we see out in the community. Our goal is down the road to get into training and certification. That's a way of sharing knowledge and developing a community around it. So, we're hoping to engage people in the development of the BOK with, and in particular those with program experience and working towards a common knowledge about how to address challenges, what processes work, and how can we collectively improve our practice. As we've developed that, we're going to work on training modules, and we've done a little bit of that in the last year. But those training modules ultimately will work across the full BOK. We'll probably start with some priorities first, and maybe risk management as a case in point could be one of them. Again, we'd like to work with the community to define what that is, but our aim is to begin to offer certification in this space. So turning our attention a little bit to technology and how it impacts grant service delivery, certainly we've seen that technology has had very incremental impacts on grant processing. For example, a lot of programs have moved either online or PDF fillable application forms. Certainly there's a lot of folks with systems, and they vary in their maturity around the internal processing of funding requests. Some people use Excel. Some people have full end-to-end systems that are based on sort of custom-built technologies. Others are moving towards sort of more generic tool sets for processing funding cases as, for example, case management tools. And many are trying to figure out optimal ways of tracking and reporting on program results using databases like Access or in some cases more sophisticated tools. But overall, what I've seen is the approach to technology integration into the service delivery model for grants has been rather piecemeal and not really transformative, and there's some real opportunities to explore the relationship between the two. So here's an example of a fillable PDF form. There's some good value in that. You can ensure rules are applied. You can sometimes streamline processing because the data can be captured out of the form and it's fit for process once it arrives at the desk of an officer. The trick is that there's limited lifecycle use in that information. So, for example, a client may submit that once, but if you require an amendment to it, it gets a little complicated because they have to resubmit, and the relationship is a bit challenging to manage. So, they're difficult to update, basically, and you're not looking at the life of that information downstream as it may change. The scope of what a client submits at the beginning of their project may have shifted 6 months later as you're getting into approval. The other thing that we've seen is some interesting dynamics around the exchange of financial information. There's been kind of a tug-of-war, I don't know really, maybe there's a more positive way of saying that, between the financial staff and program and operational staff, because they have fundamentally different needs for control, and there's distinct roles there. Financial systems have matured a little bit. There has been some effort I've seen to bundle functionality into financial systems that provide an operational view of information. But the real work of managing a file or of a funding case is really on the operational side. And those interactions can be managed through sort of generally accepted accounting principles, and there's some really good experience in the U.S. on that. In terms of tracking reporting, I mentioned the use of Access to do reports, but there's some really fascinating tools out there. But there's a real gap still between the data that we're capturing through an end-to-end process, including about both process and outcomes, and management reporting needs. So it's interesting to try and think about if we really started integrating technology from program, inception, and design, how would it change how the whole program is put together. So some programs are starting to think about that. I've seen some programs that really are configured even within or designed within a technology context. So things like eligible recipients or activities expenditures are based on some standards, and then the process that's applied to the information around that program is also fairly standardized. Portals are being built, so web-based portals where you can enable client interactions with officers throughout the whole process, not just, for example, at the application or at the claims or payment request stage. And that enables client information to be processed independently of funding case. So the client profile, for example, may shift things like financial statements that are required. They don't often align perfectly with the program's requirement for information around that funding case. So you can automate some of this stuff with technology in interesting ways. And officer processing a funding case in a back office solution is becoming increasingly component-based. And some of the new tools out there, if you think about it from a program inception, the integration of technology, you can actually really see some interesting collaborations among officers. You can get single views of clients even though there's multiple requests or multiple funding cases open or have been open. And you get much better use of reporting when you have an integrated view of the funding case. So end-to-end interactions mean that the process and needed information can be streamlined. And as a result, I think we're really starting to see some transformations to grants, program management, and service delivery. And we've been looking at some of the common models, requirements, and the tools emerging from various agencies as a way of sort of figuring out, how does that evolve and impact the practice and the body of knowledge that we're trying to work towards. So, examples, I mentioned earlier of the funding case, the client profile. And that really client profile information, in the past, it may have been attached to a funding request as maybe the first page, who was asking for funding. But if you think about decoupling it from that application, it really runs on its own life cycle where you really want to request or get updates for that, of that information, assess it occasionally, so has the financial situation for that client shifted, for example. You can accept and monitor it, so there's a risk dimension to that information potentially, and you want to monitor risk over time. Partly because you don't know the client, for example, it's fairly new, or partly because their financial status has changed, or maybe there's legal issues. So, there's a whole life cycle around the client profile that technology offers an opportunity to manage. In terms of funding case, Treasury Board Secretary federally has come up with a common reference model, and some of the regional development agencies that run at a federal level have been looking at the implementation of that model in a technology solution, but basically they're looking at the full end-to-end process for managing a funding case, so everything from intake and assessment to the funding decision, agreements, and how you make payments and administer and monitor the file. So there's a whole set of stakeholders too engaged in how that process model works. But integrating some of this information has some fascinating implications. So for example, if you integrate both client submission risk, you can think about means to reduce the burden back to the old 2006-2007 calls for reduced client burden, reducing red tape, and streamlining decision making. So if we explore that a little bit, and I know there's been some thinking at Canadian Heritage. They run about $1 billion worth of funding programs, quite a number of them, and they've been looking at integrating risk into their process models. I'm not sure this is the one they're actually using today, but the idea is that by looking at sort of a high-risk client and a high-risk funding case, you're into a traditional model of the type, the nature, and quality of information you ask for up front, and then the way you process that information throughout the whole funding case. But if you have a low-risk client, and they make a fairly low-risk funding request. It's an update to a funding request they made 2 or 3 years ago. You can see how you could maybe short-circuit the process. So they still need to provide an update to their application, but perhaps there's less of a need to assess the file. The agreement itself can be streamlined and made more simple. The administration of the file could focus less on administrative aspects of reporting, for example, and more on performance-related aspects. And even audits, you can still do them, but you may audit those files less or on a different rules basis than higher-risk files. So, that model in turn has big implications for program resources. So you can, if you start looking at programs and looking at the level of effort required to process funding cases, the overall effort can be reduced fairly significantly if you integrate these risk-based models. So you're making it easier for clients, you're making it easier for officers to process files, and maybe the program can shift its focus from file processing onto program and performance management. So looking at what is being accomplished with the results, who's generating among my client mix the best return for the investment, do I need new clients, and how do I get them? Because you can start to profile, and then you can start to refine the program so that it's actually driving towards the result it's designed to accomplish. So it's interesting to think about this. Heritage, I think, somewhere between, they figured somewhere between 30 and 70% of program resources on funding case processing could be reduced based on this risk model. So I'm going to pass the floor back to Eric because he's going to talk about a case study where there's been a fair amount of automation on some of the themes I've talked about. Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, so we're going to take a look at what one granting agency has done. We selected this case study because they're fairly leading edge in terms of the types of business models, grant business models they're using and the type of technology that they've applied. And we'll kind of try and focus in on some of the things that Doug referenced, like a common view of the client, a common grant processing model, common financial model, and risk-based assessment. So the SMART program is an Ontario government program. It was developed to improve productivity within Ontario manufacturers. They had $25 million from the Ontario government, to apply to this. So project funding was up to $50,000, which represented, it was a contribution program, so this would represent about 50% of the overall project cost. And it was a typical grant or contribution process. That started with a detailed grant application, followed by an assessment, then an agreement, then some post-award management like progress reports and payment claims, that sort of thing, and then, of course, the ongoing monitoring. So this wasn't the SMART program's first rodeo. They had been managing programs for a while, but this more recent automation allowed them to sort of, review some of the better practice models for grants processing and to implement the latest technology. So some of the things that they were trying to address in their current administration of grants was the duplication of the client grantee info for each program. As Doug mentioned, there was a change in transfer payment policy a few years back that identified that a lot of grant programs kind of focused on the grant more than the client. So they would reinvent the client with every grant, and there was a suggestion there that that grant program should focus more on the client as well as the grant case itself. Also, burdensome grant administration. There's always a lot of work involved with assessment and managing the finances associated with the full cycle of a grant project. So anything you can do to sort of improve that is always a good thing. Poor capability for the client grantee to do progress reporting easily. One of the things that Doug mentioned was the amount of red tape associated with applicants applying for grant program. This is an area where we can reduce some of that red tape for the applicants. And the inability to easily roll up program performance. So programs usually have to justify themselves at the end of, during and at the end of a program. And if you can collect information throughout the granting process to make that easy, again, a good thing to accomplish. So taking a look at what the SMART program implemented, they focused on a cloud service And the cloud service has two main service components. So on the left there we see grantor-centric. So in other words, the grant officers that are managing the program from the government agency perspective. And on the right we see the grantee-centric perspective. So the applicants and recipients that are coming to an electronic service to get access to the program. So the SMART program implemented a cloud-based client relationship management software solution, Dynamic CRM, to manage the grantor side, and they implemented an online applicant service as a highly advanced government client portal that enhanced the client experience with instant service, instant response, self-registration, streamlining of processes, online submissions for applications, all that sort of thing. So it was the grantee side of the grantee focus side of the service. Was focused more on the client experience for the applicant, whereas the grantor side was focused more on the types of things that the grant officers needed to do during the course of managing a grant case. So let's drill down a bit on that grantee-centric side. So the service that supported the grantees, the online service, provided these sort of major functionalities. So obviously secure access to protect the information that the grantees were putting into the system. The ability to understand whether the grantee was an organization, an individual, depending on the type of grant programs they were applying to. The ability to provide submissions throughout the submission lifecycle. So when we think of grant programs, we think of the application, but there's often multiple submissions throughout the process, like progress reports, claims for payment, that need to happen. They need to provide exchange of information between the grantee and the grantor, to ultimately complete a grant process. A submission portfolio. In this type of service, the applicant was able to register to the system and get access to multiple grant programs and be able to go back in and review and manage these various grant programs and the associated submissions. They could also do in-band requesting of if they had a particular issue to address. They could communicate electronically with the officer associated with that through this request management capability. So that's a quick overview of the type of capability that the SMART program was providing to the external applicants. And if we drill down a bit on what the screens would look like from an applicant point of view, here we see a screen that would appear once an applicant is registered to the system. And up in the top left, we see the client profile. So this service would immediately request the client to identify themselves, provide some demographics. So getting back to Doug's comment on more client-centric focus in grant management, the system allowed the SMART program to manage clients and sustain the information on the client over multiple grant programs. So in the case of the SMART program, they did have multiple programs. Up there in the left, we see sort of the SMART Green Assessment Program, which was like a precursor program that funded assessing the applicant for a later stage project funding called Smart Green Project, which would allow them to get more funding, assuming that they pass the initial assessment. So in each one of these programs, the applicant was able to drill down, get access to the various submissions that were required, to complete them, submit them, and manage them. And of course, these submissions would go into the program, and they would be available to the grantor side of the service. So let's talk a bit about that. So the grantors need to manage and capture client data. They need to manage the applicant throughout the process through a grant case management cycle. They need to engage with the applicant through meetings and email and telephone calls and so forth. So a government-centric approach. So if we look at that side of the cloud service that the SMART program implemented, we see these kinds of features. So up on the left, we see stakeholder management. There's often many types of roles involved in the granting process, from partners, reviewers, referees, applicants, and so forth. So the ability to manage all these different stakeholder relationships. Submission management, the ability to receive submissions into the program. We saw that external-facing side, so this would be the officer's view of those submissions coming into the system. Risk-based assessment, the ability to review and automatically assess applications as they come in to adjust the due diligence process to make the administration of these grants simpler. The ability to sort of manage a complete case file, to document proper due diligence on the full life cycle of the grant case, the ability to generate agreements, and the ability to manage the project finance. So Doug talked about the financial model that's fairly well accepted now that separates corporate finance from the grant operation. So in the case of the SMART program, they would manage the finances within the CRM system at the project level, and then they would send key transactions to corporate finance to, things like committing funds, approving funds, and releasing funds. So the financial folks could maintain financial control while the grant officers could maintain operational and project level finance control. So of course, there's the ability to manage multiple decision phases and more the ability to connect with grantees, the grantee community through social media. So that's an overview of the type of functions that the service provided for the grantor side. So now drilling a little bit deeper into what a grant officer might see in the course of using this service. Here's an example of a view for incoming submissions. So on the left we see an assessment form with a series of questions and that need to be sort of reviewed and answered. And on the right we see an online view of the submission that was completed by a grantee, and so the officer could scroll up and down and review this information while making decisions in the left-hand pane. And at the bottom of the left-hand pane, we see that there may be multiple submissions, there may be amendments if that officer perhaps needs more information and sends a request back to the grantee to resubmit their application with more complete information. And then as we move into another view, we see a typical sort of a view that a grant officer would see every day using the system. So this is a dynamic CRM screen, and on the top we see the main business phases that this grant process is going through. We see that there's an apply, an assess, an award, and a closeout phase. And on the left we see information associated with the grant case. At the very bottom on the left we see a risk assessment of high. And what this has done in the SMART system is it's indicated that there's more due diligence required on this type of application. So we see on the far right that there's a number of decision steps that the grant officer will have to go through to complete the due diligence on this higher risk application, and probably more activity in the center. In the center area, there's a capture of all the activity going on, emails going back and forth, notifications, meetings, that type of thing. So this is a kind of a typical view of how a grant officer would manage the case, communicate with the grantee or the applicants, and move the application or the various submissions through the granting process. Now, this next view, we see an accelerated process. And getting back to Doug's point about the advantage or the benefits of risk-based assessment, we see here on the bottom left a risk assessment of low. So in the case of the SMART program, it has a number of baked-in business rules. So it looks at applications when they come in and decides whether they're medium, low, or high risk, and then the officer can sort of override that. So this was determined to be a lower risk application. And at the top, we see that there's only 3 processes. There's an apply, a very brief assessment, not worth mentioning, an award, and then a closeout. And on the right, we see much fewer decision steps required to complete the due diligence and the process associated with this particular grant. So finally, the SMART program service has a fairly advanced business intelligence capability, so they're able to track both efficiency and performance. So in the case of efficiency, there are dashboards for tracking case throughput, looking to see where funding cases have been approved, like by which region, looking at what stage each grant case or grant project is within the process. And from a performance side, looking at how many projects have been approved, you know, how many funds have been released from a financial performance perspective, and you know, very importantly, you know, are the objectives of the program being met? So just to summarize, you know, getting back to the common pitfalls that the SMART program had identified as challenges, you know, poor online client experience, failing to meet client expectations for online service. So they delivered you know, a fairly advanced 24/7 online application cloud service that allowed for self-registering and self-profiling, saving work for everyone, you know, a common view of the client across multiple grant programs, and the ability to engage with the SMART program electronically throughout the process. And on the burdensome grant administration challenge, the ability to streamline the granting process, including on-the-fly risk-based application assessment, a common financial model, online payment processing, things that you know, take a lot of the work out of the administration of grants. And then finally, the inability to easily roll up program performance. We didn't really get into it in a lot of detail, but the SMART program captures performance right from the initial application submission through the assessment and then through the progress reporting at the end, and all this information rolls up into the dashboards that we saw as an example. So that's a quick overview of how one particular grant program is applying some of the more recent evolving better practices and you know, up-to-date automation as well. And now maybe, Doug, you could tell us a bit of, you know, about how people can get more information on how these better practices are evolving.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to talk about some of these themes in a fair amount of depth at our annual conference. It's the second conference we've held. It'll be held in the National Capital Region September 6th to 8th. The objective of the conference to encourage participation from those aiming to modernize their approaches. That could be program officers, program directors, people on the IT side even. Engage folks and others, stakeholders interested in building a modernization framework. So we're going to look at our BOK, at the framework driving the BOK, and make sure we're on the right track. And use that to really guide how grants and contribution programs are designed and delivered in Canada. And then, you know, we're going to talk about some insights into some innovative models. So there's some really interesting models out there. The SMART Green program is an example of that. But that can encourage and further enable modernization work. So this is a quick overview of our agenda. So day one is going to be looking at that modernization framework. Day two, we'll start to look at some more examples and how technology, discuss how technology has a role in transforming grants management. And the third day, we're going to focus on grant program performance. So those are the themes for the conference. If you're interested in participating, there will be links to register for it very shortly on the GCMA website. And so we'll make sure, we may send out a mail out just letting people know that that's available. And I just wanted to close off by saying what GCMA is and isn't. So it's really focused on efficient, effective management of grants and contributions. It's aiming to be constructive and solutions-oriented. And the goal is to be multi-stakeholder, multifaceted, and really focus on advancing that body of knowledge. You know, we're not trying to criticize existing programs or existing organizations and their practices, although we're going to be happy, I think, once we have some kind of body of knowledge to go in and help people understand if there are gaps between their current practice and what that body of knowledge represents. So that's it. Eric, maybe I'll pass the floor back to Eric since.
Yeah. So we're gonna stay online for another 5 minutes or so. If there are any questions, we know we're standing between you and lunch, at least the people in the Eastern time zone. So yeah, we'll be on hand if you decide to ask any questions through the chat feature.
Don't be shy. So we've got a couple of questions just through the chat feature. So first of all, the information about the presentation, we're going to be we've recorded the presentation. We're going to be posting it on YouTube somewhere, and we'll send the link around to those that registered for the session today. Here's a question. How did the SMART program handle identity management when clients are self-registering? Eric, can you comment on that?
Yes. So on the identity management side, so you know what? I'm not 100% sure, but the Ontario government has a one-pass authentication service. So we would have to get back to you with more details on that. But there was a single sign-on identity management approach that they had taken. So the service allows them to connect to like an authentication, like a two-factor authentication server. But what we can do is we'll take that question and it's a little more technical. We'll get back to you with a more detailed response on how they address authentication and authorization.
So another question, have you done any cost-benefit analysis of existing models for those using technology like SMART? I for one, have seen some cost-benefit analysis, and you know, the value can be pretty high. The business value of these technology solutions, for example, we mentioned the impact on program resources at the latter part of the early section of the presentation. And you know, so cost-benefit analysis really depends on the value of the program, the cost of the technology. There's lots of factors to think about when you're doing it, the timeline that you're looking at. But nonetheless, when you look at both the business value and technology value of these solutions, you know, there's a pretty high rate of return on them, I think. So I could dig around and try and provide that, or at least frameworks for how it's done. But
what comes to mind, Doug, is the case study on the HRSTC, now called ESTC, so a federal government department that did a time and motion study. And, you know, these things take a lot of time to do a time and motion study. So they looked at every, they do $1 billion in granting per year, and across many grants and contributions programs. And they looked at all the time that was being spent you know, to managing a grant from the very beginning to the very end, and they were able to determine that, and their approximate budget for grant administration was in the $100 million range, and they were able to determine that they could save 4% of that through process improvement. And that's not including risk-based process improvement. So that just sort of
just from technology, from the technology and practice.
And then another 6 or 7% from automation. You know, surprisingly, ESTC is not automated across all the programs yet. So there was a lot of room for improvement in terms of automation. Yeah. And I think, to your point, risk-based assessment would probably add another few percent onto that. So that's $10 or $12 million a year. You know, which was a pretty significant.
Well, and what I'm seeing, too, is that increasingly organizations are moving sort of to these off-the-shelf software. They're configuring off-the-shelf software rather than custom builds. And custom-built solutions, they were sort of the wave 10 to 12 years ago. Increasingly, I'm seeing organizations move away from them. They're expensive to build. They're expensive to maintain. So if you look at not only the value, the business value of new process models, but also look at the cost of, increasingly declining cost of configuring solutions that really deliver that business value. You know, on balance, the equation seems to work. I've seen a little bit of analysis done at Canadian Heritage. I talked about that a bit earlier. So in that case, they have about a $45 million annual operating spend on programs. And I think they were figuring they could, you know, cut that by about 20 to 30%. So the cost of the solution, and that's on an annual basis, so the cost of the solution is not going to be, you know, $8 million over 10 years. That's $80 million. So you can put some pretty good technology tools in place to really drive this business value home and make it easier for people to really focus on work like getting new clients in the door, focusing on program performance. And, you know, managing files is fun, but everybody finds it a little bit of a burden, I think, including the client.
A great topic for the annual conference.
Yes, exactly, yeah. You haven't represented the cost for participation for 3 days. Well, last year the fee was, I think it was $795, but there was an early bird cost, which is I think $100 less. So it's about, I'd say, in the order of $600 to $800 for the 3 days. Any other questions? Did we miss any? Well, really appreciate your participation today. Hope you'll come to our conference, and hope you'll get engaged with GCMA. We're really looking forward to building out our body of knowledge and getting people engaged. You know, there's a lot of people. I just was doing some simple math the other day, and I figure out of $40 million spend, there's got to be 4,000 to 5,000 officers alone federally managing and processing grants files. So if you extrapolate that across country, we've got a pretty good community of people that can engage. There's lots of experience and good practice there, so really excited to get people involved in building out our body of knowledge.
And just as a final thing, Stephanie, where do people get the follow-up information, the presentation, the recording? Is it the same place they registered, or do they get an email from us, or how do they?
Yeah, I think I can arrange to have a follow-up email.
Okay.
And in the follow-up email, I'll include the links for the YouTube as well.
And there was the one question that we wanted to follow up on as well, related to authentication.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get an email out to everyone to register. Thanks.
So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day, and I hope the weather is better in Canada. Certainly not great in Ottawa.